February 1st, 1945, the advance begins. The chill in the air was biting as we began our push into the Hungarian hills. The heavy snow and rugged terrain made every step a struggle. We had been ordered to advance into the mountains to secure positions and push back the Soviet forces who were closing in on us from the east. Supplies were scarce, and the men were weary. The weight of their gear, combined with the deep snow, was taking its toll. The landscape was both beautiful and menacing. The snow-covered trees and frozen rivers were eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of distant gunfire. We set up temporary camps, our breaths freezing in the air, as we prepared for what was to come. The men tried to stay optimistic, but the constant fear of Soviet attacks loomed over us. February 8th, 1945, first contact. We had been moving cautiously through the mountains for days when we finally encountered Soviet forces. They had set up a defensive position on a high ridge overlooking our approach. The battle that ensued was fierce and chaotic. The Soviets had the advantage of higher ground, and their machine guns and artillery rained down on us with terrifying precision. I remember the cold biting into my face as I ducked behind a boulder, trying to catch my breath. My comrades were scattered, some pinned down, others desperately trying to return fire. The roar of our weapons and the explosions of Soviet artillery created a deafening cacophony. We fought for hours, but the Soviets were relentless. By nightfall, we were forced to pull back, retreating to our earlier positions. February 15th, 1945, the bitter winter. Winter had fully entrenched itself, and the cold was becoming unbearable. We were now entrenched in a series of defensive positions, struggling to hold our ground against continuous Soviet assaults. The temperatures were plummeting, and frostbite was becoming a serious concern. Many men were already suffering from the cold, and we had to keep moving to avoid becoming easy targets. The Soviet attacks were unyielding. They seemed to be everywhere at once, probing our lines and launching assaults with increasing frequency. Each day felt like a battle for survival, not just against the enemy but against the elements. Supplies were running low, and we were forced to ration our food and fuel. The cold was a constant companion, numbing our fingers and toes, and making every movement a painful effort. February 22nd, 1945, the breakthrough. The Soviets had been pushing hard, and we could see the pressure mounting on our defenses. The situation was becoming critical. Our unit was tasked with holding a key position in the mountains, but the Soviets managed to break through our lines. The battle that followed was a desperate struggle to hold our ground. I recall the chaos of that day, men fighting with every ounce of strength they had, the snow stained red with blood, and the constant, terrifying whine of incoming artillery. Our defensive lines were breached, and the Soviets poured into our position. It was a fight to the last man as we tried to fend off the overwhelming enemy forces. We were eventually overrun, and many of our comrades were captured or killed. I was one of the fortunate ones who managed to escape, though I was wounded and exhausted. The retreat was a nightmare, running through the snow, trying to avoid Soviet patrols, and struggling to stay alive. February 28th, 1945, the harsh reality. By the end of February, it was clear that our position in Hungary was untenable. The Soviets were advancing rapidly, and our supply lines were in shambles. We were ordered to withdraw to a more defensible position, but the retreat was chaotic and disorganized. The men were demoralized, and the constant pressure from the Soviets made it clear that our situation was dire. As we retreated, I looked back at the snow-covered mountains, now a graveyard for so many of my comrades. The once proud German army was being pushed back, and the reality of our situation was sinking in. The Soviet advance was relentless, and our losses were mounting. Each day felt like a desperate struggle to hold on, with no clear end in sight. The harsh winter and the relentless Soviet attacks had taken their toll on us. We were exhausted, both physically and mentally, and the prospect of further fighting was grim. We were now facing the harsh reality of a war that was slipping away, and the hope of victory seemed more distant with each passing day. March 1st, 1945, the retreat. The retreat from our positions in the mountains was as grueling as the battles themselves. The Soviets were pressing hard, and we were forced to move quickly to avoid encirclement. The snow-covered landscape, which had once seemed so serene, now felt like a hostile wasteland. Every step through the deep snow was a challenge, and the cold was a constant enemy. Our ranks were thinning as we trudged through the snow. The men who had once been full of bravado and confidence were now weary and demoralized. We moved in small groups, each one trying to stay ahead of the advancing Soviet forces. The retreat was marked by frequent skirmishes, as the Soviets took every opportunity to attack our rear guard. March 5th, 1945, a glimpse of hope. As we continued our withdrawal, we received word that reinforcements were on the way. The prospect of fresh troops and supplies provided a glimmer of hope, but it was tempered by the harsh reality of our situation. The Soviet advance was relentless, and their forces were closing in from all sides. Our position was now a series of hastily constructed defensive lines. We dug in as best as we could, fortifying our positions against the relentless Soviet artillery and infantry assaults. The men were exhausted and demoralized, but the arrival of reinforcements brought a brief respite. We were able to rest and regroup, and the new supplies provided a much-needed boost. March 10th, 1945, the Soviet push. The brief period of calm was shattered as the Soviets launched a major offensive. Their attacks were more intense than ever, and our defensive lines were strained to their breaking point. The sound of artillery and machine gun fire became a constant backdrop to our efforts. The Soviet troops fought with a determination that was hard to match. They had clearly been well prepared for this push, and their coordination was impressive. Our positions were subjected to heavy bombardment, and the ground shook with each explosion. Despite our best efforts to hold the line, the Soviets were making significant gains. March 15th, 1945, the final stand. As the days passed, it became clear that our situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Soviet advance was unrelenting, and our defenses were being overrun. We were ordered to make a final stand at a key position along a river, hoping to buy time for the rest of our forces to regroup. The battle that followed was fierce and desperate. The Soviets attacked in waves, and we fought with everything we had. The river, which had once been a source of life, was now a battlefield strewn with the dead and wounded. The cold was unbearable, and the men were suffering from frostbite and exhaustion. Despite our efforts, the Soviet forces continued to push forward. Our position was gradually being encircled, and the reality of our situation became increasingly clear. The final days of fighting were marked by a sense of futility as we struggled to hold back the tide of Soviet troops. March 20th, 1945, the fall. By the end of March, it was evident that our position was untenable. The Soviets had broken through our lines, and the remaining German forces were in full retreat. The fighting had taken a heavy toll, and the prospect of further resistance seemed bleak. As we withdrew, I looked back at the battlefield. The once proud defensive positions were now abandoned, and the snow-covered ground was littered with the remnants of the conflict. The retreat was chaotic, with men fleeing in all directions, trying to escape the advancing Soviet forces. The reality of our situation was stark and unforgiving. The German army was in full retreat, and the hopes of holding back the Soviet advance were fading. The winter had taken its toll, and the relentless Soviet attacks had pushed us to the brink. The struggle for survival continued, but the end was now in sight.